Today we're going to be talking about allopatric and sympatric speciation. But before we get to that, what exactly is speciation? In class, we learned that speciation is the generation of species-level diversity. But another way of putting it is that it's the potential outcome of evolutionary mechanisms such as natural selection and other microevolutionary processes that work in concert with it. So it's anything that kind of makes one population separate into two separate populations. And there's several different ways of defining this, and we'll get into those next. Over time, scientists have come up with different ways to define what a species is, given the evidence that they've accumulated. Sometimes we don't have a perfect fossil record, or for instance, you can't study extinct organisms, in which case you have to look at the fossils, and then you would use the morphological species concept. And a species, broadly defined, is an evolutionarily independent population, and like I said, they're defined using several different concepts, like the morphological species concept, the phylogenetic species concept, the biological species concept, and I'm sure that there's another Explain Everything video on that, so I'm not going to go into it, but just know that those are the ways in which we define different species. It's easy to say that species originate by enough change occurring in a population that are significant enough to be classified in their own group, but it still doesn't explain how. So it's just like, how? Like, yeah, obviously enough change has to occur, to make them separate and no longer able to breed and whatnot. But, like, how does that happen? Like, okay, well, I'm going to tell you how. The first mode of speciation that we're going to go over is allopatric speciation. This one is pretty easy to conceptualize, and it takes place when populations are geographically separated. So that can mean like something like a river starts flowing through what was once a single landmass and separates the population enough to where gene flow is reduced and a new species evolves independently. There are two ways in which this can happen. The first is through dispersal and colonization, and the second through vicariance. The first way we said allopatric speciation occurs is through dispersal and colonization. What that means is individuals leave the source population and establish a new population somewhere else that's geographically isolated from the source population. This new population is then subject to mutation, genetic drift, and natural selection, and over this time, evolution occurs, eventually creating two populations that are isolated from one another. So here's a nice real-world example of allopatric speciation operating through dispersal and colonization. Basically, we have species A here finding its way to a geographically isolated island and kind of colonizing it there, and through, like we said, mutation, genetic drift, and natural selection, that species eventually becomes species B. Then species B is like, hey, I'm going to go over to this new island, and then that, same forces operate, becomes species C. Species C will then go back to the original island where it just remains species C, and then it also goes to a new island where it becomes species D. Then, members of the new species D go back to both of the islands, the original one that the species C from which it evolved from, and also to the original one that A over here had originally gone to. So anyway, on the original island over here, competition with species B and C force species D to adapt and evolve into species E. So we've got a lot going on here, but it's a great example of dispersal and colonization. The next way in which allopatric speciation can operate is through vicariance. This is what I was saying with the river example. Literally, a division of the population is caused by a change in landscape, creating a physical barrier to gene flow. Both populations are then subject to different mutations, genetic drift, and natural selection, causing evolution. And once again, the two populations are isolated. Here we have a nice example of allopatry by vicariance. These two species of squirrel are geographically separated by this, I'm pretty sure it's a river, or it could just be cracks in the earth, I can't really tell from the picture, but regardless, there is a geographic barrier separating these two populations, and enough evolution has occurred to isolate them from one another and become two separate species. The next mode of speciation we're going to go over is sympatric speciation. This occurs within the same geographic location, even when gene flow is possible. Sympatric speciation is very common in plants through polyploidy, so oftentimes the offspring generation is unable to produce viable offspring or mate at all with the parental generation because they have a different number of sets of chromosomes. This creates a lot of diversity in plants, and another example, like we went over in class with the apple maggot flies, is that the two species are in the same location, yet they do not have any gene flow because for the apple maggot case, they have different host trees, but sometimes it can be something like they mate during different times of the day or different seasons, and just the isolation from one another creates a barrier to gene flow, which then creates two separate species.